Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today, I have a wonderful guest with us. Many of you know him. This is our resident music nerd at the Fayetteville Symphony Orchestra, Dr. Joshua Busman. You may also recognize him from some of our education videos. Joshua is the father of Arthur, who is the star of the Storytime at with Arthur videos. And Josh has agreed to meet with me today to talk about something very specific, and that is Ludwig van Beethoven. But before we do that, Josh, just so people get to know a little bit more about you, you are a musicologist. You have degrees in musicology, and I bet a lot of people don't know what that's all about. So fill us in.
Yeah, so thanks, and I'm glad that I could be here in lieu of my much more famous offspring at this point. Yeah, so musicology, it sort of is to music what art history is to art. But if you think about art history, you wouldn't imagine that an art historian is just establishing dates and that sort of stuff. They're thinking about the cultures that produce the art. They're thinking about connections across time or across space. You know, how is the art in the Netherlands different from the art in Italy or France, right? How are artistic traditions traveling across the globe, right? How is commerce involved in this? How is it connected to literature? How is it connected to all sorts of other things? So musicology is sort of writ large that study of music in the context of human life. How does music get produced in the course of human life, and then how does it become meaningful in the course of human life?
Fascinating. So, jumping right in then, Beethoven was this sort of force of musical nature, if you will. And there's so much of the context, the socio-political climate in his life that, he was a part of that sort of allowed him to become what he became. So as we talk about Beethoven, I mean, let's just try and tackle the first thought here, and that is the impact of Beethoven on music. I had as a music student, we study music history, and 19th century music historian asked the class, try and describe the 19th century musical, world without using the word Beethoven.
Yeah.
Pretty impossible.
It's very difficult. Yeah. Yeah, it's I mean, I think, oftentimes when I'm teaching that sort of 19th century class, I talk about these pieces or composers that, end up reconfiguring everything around them, right? In the 19th century, typically there's sort of two, right? It's Beethoven at the beginning of the century, and it's Wagner at the end of the century. I think one of the analogies I often use with my students is to think about, if you think about the history of film, there's sort of two categories of innovators that are really important to know about. Some of whom are the creative people, the people who are making films. But someone like Thomas Edison is also essential to the history of film because he invented the camera, right? And so there are some composers that I think we have to understand as people who are primarily invested in inventing a camera, right? And students listen to this very wacky 20th century music, and you have to say, well, this is sort of inventing a camera. Maybe, if you look at a Thomas Edison film of a candle being snuffed out, or two cats in boxing gloves, or whatever weird things he filmed as camera tests, and you go, well, this isn't a very good film. You're sort of missing what he's doing, which is he's inventing a new technology.
Right.
Beethoven is one of those rare composers that sort of invents a camera and then makes a bunch of films with it.
Right.
So we
Great way to put that.
contend with him on both levels, both as this person who really sort of invents and standardizes this totally new symphonic language, and then also makes all of the most seminal works in that new language, right, which is really unusual in music history.
Yeah. So when we musicians, we fall in love with it, and then we start studying, and then the curtain is sort of pulled back, and we start to see, oh wow, okay, the good, bad, and the ugly, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I was so surprised in studying Beethoven in graduate school on a deeper level than I'd ever studied Beethoven before, how much of the socio-political climate of the time informed and really just opened up the pathway for him to invent. Talk a little bit about that, if you would. I find it so fascinating, that it wasn't just this guy with this, these incredible pieces in his mind, putting it on paper, and then getting it performed. So much else has to happen And
absolutely.
it takes a lifetime, if not, several, to create the right environment for someone like Beethoven to flourish.
Yeah, I think so. Um, Maybe the clearest way to see that sort of transition as it's happening in this moment that Beethoven is occupying is to look at the person that Beethoven is sort of studying with him when he arrives in Vienna, which is Joseph Haydn. Um, Haydn, is a generation prior to Beethoven, but he almost occupies a totally different musical world.
Yeah.
Um, for Haydn, he's writing music in for a patron, in his case, the Esterhazy family, this immensely wealthy sort of Austro-Hungarian family. Um, and so he really, especially at the beginning of his career, would have approached music more as a sort of artisan craftsman than as an artist, right? I compare it often to it's more akin to making a chair than it is to making a painting, right? And if you think about all of the implications that would have, right? How do you assess whether a painting is good or not? Well, there's really abstract criteria, and maybe it takes particularly sort of expert voices to sort of weigh in and say, how do you assess whether a chair is good or not? Well, there's some pretty concrete criteria. Can I sit in it? Does it fit underneath the table? Whatever it is it comfortable to
Right.
sit in? Um, and so I think for Haydn, there's a certain level at which there is that sort of artisan practicality, right? Whether or not a symphony was a good piece of music ultimately boiled down to, like, did it make the Esterhazy dinner party better?
Right.
Because if it did, then that was good. That's what symphonies were supposed to do.
Right.
Um, and by the time we get to Beethoven, like I said, not that much further forward, it's that whole matrix has been reconfigured, in part because of the way that the funding structure has been reconfigured. So this patronage system where composers would basically be put on retainer by large institutions, whether that was wealthy families, whether it was a cathedral, or the court of a sort of bishop or archbishop, whether that was a member of the royal family. These sort of patronage relationships were drying up, and so Beethoven, and to some degree Mozart, the composer he probably most idolized, but who died just before he arrived in Vienna to study with him. Beethoven was one of the first generation of composers who's really turning to a public as a way to sort of financially and logistically support their career, rather than to a specific sort of wealthy or institutionally powerful patron. So in some ways, that goes almost further to explaining Beethoven's approach to the genre more than anything, right? He's writing works that are designed to sort of hit a public with the kind of impact that would not only get them to buy a ticket to come see, but would get them to buy any ticket for any future piece that he might write. Right? He really has to think about cultivating and maintaining a public persona in a way that composers had not really had to think about before.
Right. Yeah, and you look at those early concerts of his that he put on, and they're like 4 or 5 hours long. They have two symphonies, they have concertos, they have, you name it, as much as he could cram in there to
Mm-hmm.
get his work out there. Because also it's important to realize that there were no recordings, there was no way of hearing music other than actually being there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or buying the score and taking it home and playing it yourself.
right.
Right? I mean,
Yeah,
this another piece I think that is lurking there is obviously music publishing is entering domestic spaces in a way that it hadn't, right? With sort of this Enlightenment ethos, with broader access to education. It became fashionable among a certain set of the middle class to go and buy a string quartet score and then take it home and play it with your friends. And in fact, those Opus 1 piano trios that he publishes when he gets to Vienna, the first thing that he publishes is a set of piano trios, so piano, cello, and violin. The sales for those piano trios actually pay his rent for a whole year. That is often a relatable metric when I'm communicating to students. Like, imagine that you tried something out and then it ended up paying your rent for a year. That would be a
right.
pretty good incentive to keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, and interestingly about those trios, so Haydn, who he was studying with, sort of,
Right.
encouraged him to try and get these trios published, except for the third one in C minor, which Haydn thought was just people weren't going to understand it. It's a little too, you're pushing the boundaries a little bit too much.
Mhm.
And of course, Beethoven, being, very confident, said, well, sorry, I'm going to go ahead and do it. And, the rest is history. And
Right.
what's also interesting about that, too, that third trio, the C minor trio, you think about C minor and Beethoven. I mean, we're talking about, this is the key of brooding. This is
Mm.
the key of the uber angst Beethoven that a lot of us love, like the Fifth Symphony, the Third Piano Concerto.
Mhm.
I mean, just this really uh, this key that really he spoke
Mhm.
through. Anyway, um, so yeah, I mean the whole socio-political thing is fascinating to me. How at the time that Beethoven gets to Vienna, essentially these two markets for music start to emerge.
Yeah.
It's not the patronage system like you were talking about, where it's through the court or through the church. There is a private, market for it,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden composers, can compete in this market. And it's interesting how Beethoven works in both almost. I mean, he was very much supported by patrons and encouraged at a certain point to continue pushing the boundaries,
Yeah.
because the markets, from what I learned, is that the markets, they wanted to separate themselves from one another. The lecker and the kenner, right? The
That's right.
knowledgeable and then the amateur. And the knowledgeable, the art music, if you will, the serious music, if you will, they found in Beethoven their champion. So
Mhm.
they encouraged Beethoven to write these pieces that the world had never seen before, and kept paying him to do it. And then other composers, for example, Schubert, wrote a ton of things that could be played in a small room by amateur musicians, as
Mhm.
well as some great, art music as well. But it's just so fascinating how, you know, the socio-political climate of a particular age dictates what art comes out, and then, how history treats it, and how, especially in Beethoven's case, how history has romanticized Beethoven to the point of where we think of him, as this, he just wrote for the sake of writing these great things. But really, he did it for money, just like all composers,
That's
and he
right.
had to survive and he had to pay his rent. um,
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, there definitely is. I think in addition to the things that are happening sort of during Beethoven's life, which another one that I'll add is sort of can't talk about the rise of Beethoven without talking about the rise of the piano, which was becoming the sort of dominant instrument on the continent. And actually is a really great microcosm for how he sort of pushed the boundaries in general. The Hammer Clavier Sonata, for instance, when he puts that out, he's writing it with all of these at the time were these sort of extended piano techniques, extended range, using the una corda pedal, the soft pedal on the piano, which wasn't really sort of widely available. So he's writing this piece for a piano that only kind of exists, and basically calling that piano into being
yeah, right,
through sort of standardizing repertoire for it. So
yeah,
that's a really interesting piece as well. But I think another thing that you have to think about is uh, sort of, especially in the moments right after the years right after his death, two really powerful forces are sort of creating this Beethoven myth basically as soon as he's dead. One is the discovery of the Heiligenstadt Testament, this letter that he writes famously to his brothers in 1802 and never sends, but in which he describes what at this point is almost a sort of caricature of the tortured creative person, struggling with his own issues of mental health and with his separatedness from the world as a result of his increasing deafness, and then the way that plays itself out in his art, right?
yeah,
So that was sort of one piece of it, and another piece of it was that he comes along at a moment at which there is this rising tide of sort of national sentiment. I mentioned this actually in the video we just put out with the
yeah,
Dvorak
right,
Strait Serenade, right? But we tend to think of Germany and Italy and these European countries as sort of the old world. Oh well, that was the Roman Empire; it's been there forever. But like the Italian state came about around the time of our Civil War. It's not
right,
that old.
right, right,
And the German state is the same way. And so, obviously Beethoven was someone who was very attentive to that. We can see that in his dedication of the Eroica Symphony first to Napoleon, and then
right,
removing that dedication when it becomes clear that Napoleon is not this radical democratic figure that he was thought to be.
yeah,
But there's also, I think, a sense of for a lot of German people, Beethoven expressed and almost perfected this sense of the German spirit, which was around the time that Germany was beginning to define itself as a state too.
Right. Yeah. It's incredible. So, just to kind of contain ourselves here, because I know we could just go on and on and on with this. You know, the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth is December 16th, 2020. And this whole year, as much as orchestras have been allowed to do safely and what has been possible, there have been these celebrations of his music, his life, his story. I mean, he is seen, as you said, he's been romanticized into this hero, if you will. And it almost seems like it falls at a time where the wind has been taken out of it, not just because of the virus and how that's impacted, just the ability to perform, but also, the I guess the self-examination that society, and in particular, organizations of education and art are doing, looking at the systemic issues of racism and inequality that have been in the fabric of all of these organizations. And then, how does, I mean, is it a Beethoven celebration in the midst of organizations like the orchestra trying to celebrate diversity, equity, and inclusion? It's a balancing act. I mean, I find myself very much in the middle of, we have to sell tickets. We have to raise money. We are a nonprofit organization. We need to play Beethoven. We need to celebrate Beethoven. But at the same time, we're in the midst of this new era. And we at the Fayetteville Symphony are very committed to doing our part to rewrite our history, if you will. So, what are your thoughts on all that? I mean, it's not the Beethoven 250th celebration year I think everyone was thinking it was going to be, and it's not just because of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we think about these sort of celebrations, right, I think one thing, that is unimpeachably positive, right, is that we want to always sort of be willing and able to celebrate the great music of the past and find a way to sort of make it relevant for new generations, right? I think for most people, really prior to the 19th century, their listening horizon would only have gone back 50 or 60 years, which is true for most people today. If you ask them, what's the oldest music you regularly listen to? I suspect most people probably would stop about 1950 and would not go sort of further back than that. So I think the idea of maintaining that sort of historical connection is great. I think where we often run into problems is when we take that sort of the vitality of that historical connection and use it to basically crowd out everything else, right? And so there's a difference between saying Beethoven's music has endured and deserves to be celebrated, and saying, basically that Beethoven is the sort of unimpeachable standard that must never be violated.
Right.
Which I think is less hopeful. And one of the challenges, as you alluded to, right, is that oftentimes orchestral programming is a zero-sum game, right? If I put a Beethoven symphony on there, it means I'm bumping something else off, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think you're exactly right that this is a delicate balance to strike. I think one of the things that we can see in Beethoven's music is a sort of celebration of this sort of vitality and this sort of risk-taking creativity, right? And maybe one of the ways to celebrate Beethoven is not just to play the Fifth Symphony for the 100th time, but to sort of celebrate music that exhibits that same vitality and creative risk-taking in whatever context it is we find ourselves.
Yeah, because the sentiment. I mean, if it's something patriotic, I mean, people from various nations celebrate their patriotism. I mean, patriotism in itself is very similar. Anyway, so I'd like to close with just a little bit. What are some of your favorite stories of Beethoven, his life? Like, what are like some of his quirks, anything like that? And then, what are some of your favorite pieces of Beethoven?
Yeah, so one of my favorite Beethoven sort of anecdotes, probably apocryphal, but that I think gets at some of the things we're talking about. This sort of mythos of Beethoven and this confidence that he seems to show from such a young age. There's a story that Beethoven and the famous German writer Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who wrote Faust and Sorrows of Young Werther and a whole bunch of other things, but that he and Beethoven are walking, and Goethe, being the sort of very distinguished Enlightenment era gentleman he is, they approach two young ladies who are coming past them. Goethe steps off the path and sort of leans down and takes his hat off, um, and Beethoven just keeps walking and barrels right between these two women and keeps going. So of course Goethe rejoins him on the path and says, "Man, what are you doing? Like, you totally embarrassed us. What were you thinking?" And he says, apocryphally, there are something like, there are princes and princesses galore, but there is only one Beethoven.
He never married, by the way, folks. He never
That's
married.
exactly right. Yeah, maybe some of that boorish behavior helps explain that, right? But there's so many anecdotes like that, right? The famous story of him being in rehearsal for one of the symphonies and the violin player saying, I don't think this is playable. Like, I don't think I can play this. And he says, "Do you think I can think of your puny fiddle when God hands these lines down to me from on high?" So I think it shows you again this sort of the kind of mythos that grows up, not just that these are the stories that persist, but that they're rooted in some kind of overdeveloped confidence maybe that he had.
Definitely.
In terms of favorite pieces, I think for me the one that I always go back to is the Eroica Symphony. It's the third symphony. It really is a piece that I think, especially if you can sort of put yourself in that mindset, maybe by listening, listen to Mozart 41, listen to a Haydn, one of the Haydn London symphonies, and then listen to the first movement of the Eroica. It really is like it comes from another planet. I mean, it's so the harmonic language, the way he's using form, it's just it's like a totally new application of the language.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. For me, I guess, to try and pick my favorite Beethoven, that's really, really hard. I mean, for me, that's one of the hardest questions. People often ask musicians, "What's your favorite piece of music?" And it's like I can't answer that. There's so many that I love. But we love to play Beethoven. We're very fortunate that we've been allowed to do these recordings and share some of our favorite movements, over the past few weeks, and doing our part to try and celebrate the 250th anniversary of this incredible composer and person that really forever changed music and the orchestra. I mean, I often tell people, if Beethoven wrote faster than anyone, he wrote higher than anyone, lower. I mean, every direction you can go, he expanded it at the time, and really just wrote some of the greatest music of all time, and we'll continue to play it for sure. And I'm really excited too at this new era that we're in. We're going to be hearing from voices that we haven't heard from the past and from today, composers that have been marginalized for various reasons. And I look forward to putting them alongside great composers like Beethoven and Mozart and Haydn and some of the people we talked about today. Josh, thank you so much for your time today. And we look forward to getting you back on the stage look forward to get everybody back on the stage and having you enlighten the audiences before our performances. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.